Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Shaver, and I'm the State Forester for the Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Indiana. I apologize for not being with you in person today, but I had a few other conflicts, and I'll try to make sure I get to the next meeting. Today, I want to take a little bit of time to go over some of the updates and changes with our programs and practices in Indiana. We'll jump right in with the change in administration. So we had an administration change this year. NRCS received a new chief of NRCS, Aubrey Betancourt. She started off at a fast pace with a lot of changes. She kind of focused us with her core principles that she outlined, and these aren't going to be very shocking to you, but NRCS is still focused on one-on-one technical and financial assistance to private landowners. We are leading science-based conservation. We have a locally driven approach with offices in every county in Indiana. And our work is voluntary conservation. Landowners come to us if they're interested in technical or financial assistance. We are not regulatory. We're not out knocking on doors so much. We tend to wait for those landowners to come to us. When you look at the funding for NRCS programs in Indiana, it stayed fairly consistent over the last few years. We did see a spike in funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. But if you look back at 2025, you can see here that about 53% of our funding went to the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and 27% went to the Conservation Stewardship Program. These are the two biggest programs in Indiana for private landowners. When you look specifically at our practices and where the money was spent in 2025, brush management, which is the practice we use to do invasive species control, was our number one practice. It's very popular. It's also very expensive. And unfortunately, we have a big problem with invasive species across the landscape, not only on our forest land, but on our pasture lands and associated ag lands. It's a real menace. The second most popular forestry practice is forest stand improvement, and you can see that made the top 10 of practices for Indiana, with a little over $1.5 million going to forest stand improvement, which is primarily controlling grapevines, thinning, crop tree release, getting rid of poor formed and damaged trees in our forest. So what does 2026 look like for NRCS? Our funding levels are fairly similar. You can see in FY25, we had about $50 million. That was partially inflated with the Inflation Reduction Act money. For 2026, our initial allocation for EQIP is $21 million, and our initial allocation for CSP is $16 million. The reason we say initial allocation is because Indiana is a great state, and then we often spend all of this money, obligate it to contracts, and if other states across the nation have not used all of their funding, we can kind of gobble that up and use that for our applications here in Indiana. There's a note on here about 25% going to RPP, and I'll explain that program in a few minutes. Let's take a quick look at deadlines. This is always a concern for foresters and landowners in Indiana. Our deadline for EQIP this year was actually back in January 15th, on January 15th of 2026. Our ranking deadline is April 17th, and we should have contracts obligated by July 2nd. So what this means is that we've already received all the applications that we're going to look at this year for funding for EQIP, but we're still working with our forestry partners to figure out what exactly needs to be done and at what level. And so that's why that ranking deadline is important, is because right now we're kind of in a scramble to get all of that information collected so that we can build contracts for landowners and get them obligated by July 2nd. So our forestry partners do a lot of this work. At the start of 2026, there was a big push for streamline and efficiency. That was the focus of this new administration. As such, they did away with a number of things that we've used in Indiana for a few years. For a couple of years, we had a cost of living allowance, a COLA, that adjusted the payment rates for landowners depending on where you lived. Those were done away with in 2026. We also got rid of climate smart agriculture and forestry. The Inflation Reduction Act was done away with. And unfortunately, when the Inflation Reduction Act went away, the Southern Indiana Sentinel Landscape RCPP which was a very nice initiative in South Central Indiana that had a lot of benefits to forest land. That funding was taken away and that project was not allowed to move forward. So we lost that project. We still have the Southern Indiana Sentinel Landscape in Indiana. They're doing great things. They just don't have a financial arrangement with NRCS at this point. Another big streamline and efficiency that occurred was working through our payment schedules for NRCS. And this is a little bit behind the scenes, but historically we would have had 30 or 40 different scenarios for brush management. In Indiana, we would then pick the 4, 5, or 6 that fit well for what we did, and those would be the ones that we would prioritize in Indiana. This year, they said, we're not keeping track of all those payment schedules anymore. We're going to make 6 or 7 national scenarios. They'll be the same all across the nation. They can be interpreted differently, but the same payment rate. So this is a lot less to keep up with and monitor and maintain. So they did that. It's going to work out in Indiana, but it's going to be a little bumpy this first year or so as we get used to these new payment schedules. One of the big changes is that they came out and said we are no longer doing cost share in Indiana or in USDA for NRCS. For years and years, we have promoted our cost share programs and that our incentives would have covered about 75% of the cost of doing the work on a landowner's property. That was kind of the standard for EQIP. We're no longer saying the word cost share. We now make incentive payments. That incentive payment is the payment to implement the practice. It is not to reimburse the landowner for the expense. So our incentive payment could cover 100% of the project, 50% of the project, 150% of the project. It no longer matters. If a landowner agrees to implement our practice, they are going to get that incentive payment regardless of what it costs them. And it's their responsibility to find out if it's financially beneficial for them to accept our payment or engage in the contract to get the work done. These rates are nationally approved and they are published. If you want to see these rates, you can go to the Indiana NRCS website, go to the page for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, scroll all the way down to the bottom to additional documents, and you'll see they're listed there as PDFs. You can download these and look at them at your leisure. A few other new things for EQIP and CSP as part of their streamlining and efficiency measures is that this year EQIP and CSP will use the same incentive payments. In the past, EQIP might have paid this much for forest stand improvement and CSP paid this much. This year, it's the same. If you sign up for the practice in EQIP or CSP, you're going to get the same incentive payment. The differences between those programs is that EQIP is what we call our fix-it program. It allows landowners to focus on an individual tract of forest land. They can enroll just that tract into the program. They get funded, they can do the work on that tract, and you're paid as soon as that work is done. With the Conservation Stewardship Program, if you own 10 different tracts of forest land in Indiana or 10 tracts in Indiana and a couple out of state, all of those have to be included in your conservation stewardship application. That application is a minimum of 5 years. You will get paid a minimum of $4,000 each year you're in the program. And then if you implement practices on some of those acres you enroll, you will receive the incentive payment. And if that incentive payment is greater than $4,000, you get that greater amount for that year. If one of the years you don't have any incentive payments or a very low incentive payment, you're still going to get the minimum of $4,000 a year for CSP. For CSP this year, we still have not set our deadlines. The application deadline was back on January 15th, but our ranking and our obligation deadlines have not been set because we are still figuring out the adjustments to this program with making the practices the same as EQIP and how that's going to work for landowners. So that information should be coming out in the next month or so. We'll get that out to our foresters and our planners and out to landowners as quick as possible. The other program I mentioned that was new this year was the Regenerative Pilot Program. This is a program that came out with this administration, and they require us to put 25% of our EQIP money and CSP money towards the Regenerative Pilot Program. This is a little bit more like CSP, and it's a minimum of a 5-year contract. You have to enroll your whole farm in the program, and you must do soil testing in the first and last year of the contract. With the RPP program, you have to be implementing at least one priority practice, which you can see on this list highlighted in red. Forest stand improvement did make the list of priority practices. As long as you're doing a priority practice, you can do supporting practices. So a landowner could still do 3 years of brush management as a supporting practice, forest stand improvement in year 4, and that would be a perfectly acceptable regenerative pilot program application. If you just want to do invasive species control brush management, that would not qualify for the regenerative pilot program. You have to do a priority practice. If you go into RPP, you also have to do this soil testing in the first year and last year of your contract. It's required regardless of land use. And we typically don't do soil testing on forest land, but with this program, we have to. So what we're recommending in Indiana is that if a landowner has both forest land and cropland in their application, they do the soil testing on the cropland. You don't have to do it on every acre of land, and you don't do it on forest land. But if all you have is forest land in your application, you will have to do the soil testing on forest land. NRCS does provide financial assistance to do that, but you'll have to find a soil person to do that testing on your forest land. So let's take a quick look at some of our practices. Just because I told you they changed a little bit, we've got fewer payment scenarios, and there's going to be a little bit of confusion. But like I said, this will work out in Indiana. We have a lot of forestry practices. I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. Again, the biggest one in Indiana that we use is 314 brush management. The names have changed on these payment scenarios, but the work has stayed the same. We're still going to pay for 3 years of treatment at a decreasing incentive payment level each year. By the end of 3 years, you're required to have 95% of the invasive species controlled. Names are confusing, and you can see on the table on the bottom left, what we used to call a very heavy infestation is now called biological control low density. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but that's the name of the payment scenario. It's still going to pay roughly what we did last year for a very heavy infestation, and we kept the same percentages. So management plans that were written in the past, we can translate that all to these new scenarios, but just know they don't make much sense. To treat a medium infestation now, we call it the split method. I don't know what the split method is. It doesn't matter what the split method is. We're still going to control a medium level of infestation of invasive species. So don't worry about the names. Just worry about what has to be done. Tree and shrub establishment was the same way. They switched it this year to a different payment. It was a per tree payment. We really don't like that in Indiana. So we had to adopt the scenario called direct seeding, but we don't do direct seeding in Indiana. It's been proven not to be effective. It's hard to maintain. It's hard to account for. It's just not successful. So we're still going to plant bare root seedlings, as you can see on this table. Even though the scenario is called direct seeding, we're going to plant bare root seedlings. We can still protect seedlings. With this protection of natural regeneration, we can put up fences or tree tubes or cages. We can still plant in forest openings with the medium container with protection scenario. The names have changed, but the work requirements have stayed the same. Forest stand improvements, no different. And again, this is streamlined and efficient, but it's going to be confusing for a couple of years. With forest stand improvement, the main forest stand improvement scenario is now called tree marking scenario. But you'll see here I noted that it is not authorized for tree marking only. You still have to do the work of girdling trees and cutting grapevines. And we put this all together in a table. I've mentioned these tables. If you're wondering where you find those, we put these together in what we call a practice user guide, which is available publicly for people to look at. And it steps through all of the requirements, like what our priorities are in Indiana and how to implement those practices on the landscape. And finally, we do help pay for writing management plans. We are a planning first agency. And so the CPA 106 and DIA 165 are what we call a forest management plan. They're typically planned together on the same acres at the same time. And once you do both halves of that and put them together, you have a forest management plan These plans are written by our technical service providers in Indiana. We have about 23 foresters that have gone through our program to become a technical service provider, and they can write these plans for you. So with that, I'm going to stop. Normally I would ask for questions, but since this is a recording, I don't get to take any questions today, but I hope I can be with you all at the next meeting in person and present some different information as well as take questions. If you do have any questions, please reach out to myself at the information provided here, or you can always go through Jack or Brenda, and they will get your questions to me, and we'll happily take the time to answer those. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your meeting.